This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. I want to take a moment to tell you about a podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute called Identity Crisis. This podcast is creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life. It's hosted by Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, who sits down with a wide range of guests, politicians, authors, writers, and more to discuss current events, Jewish values, and the big questions facing Jewish life. This podcast has a genuine curiosity and humility about the critical and complex issues, everything from what it means to be a Jewish leader during this divisive moment to the experience of being a Palestinian in Israel today. You will find Identity Crisis enriching and enlivening. Check it out, Identity/Crisis with Yehuda Kurtzer, wherever you get your podcasts. Hey everyone, Jody here. Welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. I'm recording this early on the morning East Coast time of Sunday, June 8th, and this is the day that we are then putting out the episode, so a quick turnaround, as they say in the business. Look, I'll be honest, we were intending to run an episode today as part of this Sunday Context series about William F. Buckley. There's this big new biography about him that's getting a lot of attention, and we've done a couple episodes that touch on Buckley and the intellectual roots of the modern conservative movement, and I thought it might be interesting to provide some context. But then, like a lot of you, I started to see the news from Los Angeles come in. Of course, this is a quickly changing, evolving story, but Friday and Saturday in LA, we saw increasing resistance to raids by ICE to arrest and deport Los Angeles residents. These protests were from relatively small groups, hundreds of people, but these were citizens of LA standing in the way of federal agents trying to round up their immigrant neighbors. And then, late on Saturday, a big moment when the Trump administration called in, over the objections of the governor of California, the National Guard. Usually, local officials request that the National Guard get sent in. This is the first time that the president has overruled local officials and sent in the National Guard since 1965, when LBJ sent the National Guard to Alabama to protect civil rights protesters during integration, over the objection of George Wallace. This, of course, is a bit of the opposite. Trump wants the Guard to suppress what many of us see as civil rights protests, certainly constitutionally protected protests. Now again, I'm coming to you right in the middle of this story. There's a lot of things that may change, that certainly will change. It's unclear how this will play out. And in moments like these, the specific legal framework in which an act like this is taken really matters, or in theory, in a constitutional democracy, it should matter. For instance, so far, no invocation of the Insurrection Act. So there's that. But as we think about some Sunday context, from my vantage point, I will say, as someone who has hosted this show for many years and done a bunch of stories about moments of uprising and violence and resistance, it is remarkable how many of these stories have that moment where I find myself saying, and then they called in the National Guard. And from my vantage point, that moment is often one of desperation on the part of authorities. At least on Friday and Saturday in California, we're talking about a couple hundred protesters. And there's this incredibly militarized LAPD and local law enforcement on the scene who explicitly said that they didn't need federal support. And now 2,000, maybe more, National Guard troops are being sent in. It feels like an overreaction. And I think a lot of Americans will see it as such. Now, it may have dire consequences, and I suspect it is a move meant to provoke further reaction, but it is important to keep in mind the theater of it all, the optics of it all. And that is also something I've seen again over and over in these stories. The National Guard moment, it gets attention and it galvanizes the various narratives. Having done so many episodes that had a moment like this where you say, and then they called in the National Guard, I will also say that it is a move that rarely leads to what I would call reconciliation or justice. And now it sometimes signals the beginning of the end of the actual violence because the National Guard can be a really overwhelming presence, but it signals the start of the political, cultural, and optics fallout. So it is, safe to say, a really big moment. I'm going to be watching it with a historical lens, just like you are. All right, so those are my thoughts this morning, and now how do I pivot to bringing you an episode from the archives that might provide a little context or just a good listen, which is kind of the goal of this Sunday series. We haven't done specific episodes about resistance to immigration raids, and like I said, there aren't that many moments in the history of this country that reflect the use of the National Guard in exactly this way. But we have done a bunch of episodes about Los Angeles, and I do think the LA of it all matters in this moment. A huge multicultural city full of immigrant communities. Many times that can lead to tension. Sometimes that can lead to solidarity, which in my mind is a lot of what I'm seeing play out right now. Neighbors standing up for each other. So, again, this isn't the smoothest transition, but I was thinking about LA and violence and immigrant communities, and I thought about an episode we did on the Zoot Suit Riots of the 1940s. So here it is. It just so happens to be one of my favorite episodes. When people ask me about the best episodes we've ever done, I often do mention this one. It's a few years old at this point, so I think it's worth bringing back, and maybe it'll provide a little deeper perspective on LA as we watch this latest chapter in the city's history and our collective history play out. All right, take a listen. We'll be back with a new episode on Tuesday and more attempts to provide some Sunday context. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, June 3rd, 1943, the start of the Zoot Suit Riots in Los Angeles. Zoot Suit Riot, it's kind of fun to say, but the story itself is not very fun. It is full of all sorts of interesting layers. The Zoot Suit Riots were, in effect, a series of racially motivated attacks over the course of a week or so. Tensions had been brewing between the Mexican-American community in Los Angeles and the mostly white servicemen who were in LA preparing to deploy to the Pacific Theater in World War II. The Zoot Suit Riots were when it all burst out into the open with groups and gangs clashing in the streets. We'll go through this kind of piece by piece because there are so many layers here. There's racial tension, the way that World War II put a lot of class and cultural and generational issues into sharp relief, the way the press egged on these riots and attacks, and at the heart of it all was the Zoot Suit, a flashy style of dress that became a flashpoint for many of those issues. So, here to discuss the Zoot Suit Riots are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is my pal Emily Spivak, artist, writer, and the creator of the book and now the amazing new Netflix series Worn Stories, which highlights the connection people have with clothing. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Jody.
And I will say Emily thinks a lot about what clothes represent both for individuals and for our culture at large. So we will get to the Zoot Suit in a minute. But I guess, Nikki, can you just start by laying out the basic groups in this brewing tension? What's going on when these riots break out, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so the violence breaks out between two groups, Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and mostly white servicemen who have been shipped to California as part of their military training for World War II. The precipitating event here is kind of interesting. There had been this still unsolved murder called the Sleepy Lagoon murder of this Mexican-American man, and the police rounded up just a large group of Latino men and accused them of the murder. They would ultimately be cleared of it. But the reason that's important is because it fed into this narrative that Mexican men, that Latino men were sources of criminality and violence in Los Angeles. And these white servicemen presented themselves as sort of a force of order in Los Angeles. And so they begin to have these street clashes, which will culminate in violence against Latino men in the Zoot Suit Riots.
Yeah, and if I could add just a little more context, like we've done a lot of episodes that talk about racial tensions of the time and sort of trying to get rid of particular groups. We've talked about this with the Seattle riot as well, and it's very similar, I think, here in LA, where we think about these racial tensions in which Mexicans are being othered, and people see them as draft dodgers, they see them as extravagant, they see them as infringing upon, their either political or social spaces, and so all of this tension is really sort of drawing to a head when we have these major clashes.
And just to add one more note to this, they also see them as job stealers. There is a massive move in the 1930s and early 1940s where there's just a mass deportation of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. Like, we're talking almost 2 million people, half of which were U.S. citizens. And it's obviously illegal to just eject 1 million U.S. citizens because of their race. But that is what happened.
And Emily, in this really interesting way, the Zoot Suit, which you can describe what a Zoot Suit is, becomes a sort of symbol of so many of the issues that we just described.
Yeah, it's. I think that there are a lot of garments through history that represent, political uprisings, political upheaval, and I think that this is one really interesting example. And also just the style, the garment itself is fascinating to me too.
You want to describe it?
I mean, in my understanding, it's a suit that uses a lot of material, a lot of fabric, which, I wish I had like actual numbers or something, because it feels like it's, you look at it and it looks like it's like 2 times the amount of fabric that you would have for a regular suit that we see today. The pants were extremely baggy. The coat was very long, came down to about the knee, also very oversized. The pants were pegged at the bottom, and the suit itself also, the jacket kind of got narrower. So you almost looked like, you were a little bit of like a walking triangle, upside down, where it was wider at the top and got narrower and narrower. You were dressed up too, which I think is you were wearing dress shoes, you were wearing, a dress shirt. From, just looking at it today, I think it's beautiful.
Flashy colors, too bright, flashy colors, orange and greens and pale blues, and not your traditional suit color, for sure. Your staple navy or black.
So what was it about the suit that felt like it became, that made it such a flashpoint in all the other tensions that we're describing?
Well, one of the major things was that in the middle of World War II, we've talked about how there were rations, and those rations extended to fabric. And so one of the arguments made against the Zoot Suit was that these people who wore them were being indulgent, right? And they were not sacrificing for the war. And so it quickly becomes not just that you're flouting the rations, but that you're un-American, that you don't support the war. And that feeds into all of those other pre-existing racist ideas about Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Los Angeles. And so it's a way in which the very stuff of the suit becomes part of the political and racial conflict.
Emily, do you want to jump in on the rations? Because I know you've written a little bit about that in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's so interesting because, around this time also, I had this blog for the Smithsonian and wrote many years ago about rationing of nylon and nylon stockings. And so, nylon was invented just a handful of years, from what I recall, before World War II. And it was introduced to the world and introduced to the U.S. as, potentially for nylon stockings. And women loved them, flocked to them, because they'd been wearing silk stockings prior to that, and they were not nearly as durable. But then they had to, it was like they tempted everyone and they said, here, you can have these amazing stockings, these nylon stockings. I think women were going through at that point, 8 pairs of stockings a year. And then they yanked them back and they said, no, you can't use them. We actually have to use the nylon for parachutes, and for other things that are associated with the war effort. And when they did come back, there were also these nylon stocking riots, but they were, involved women standing in department store lines for hours and hours, miles long lines to get their nylon stockings when they were available again. But it wasn't, I think in that case, it didn't feel so political. It didn't, and it wasn't an indicator, and it wasn't something that you were walking around making a statement. It wasn't like you were marking yourself in some way.
It's interesting, though. I just think because Mexican Americans are already marked by their ethnicity, so that the clothing is like an additional layer, no pun intended, but like an additional layer of how people perceived them and targeted them as a result of this. But I mean, there's so much, I think, that's cultural here too, because when I think about Black culture and Latino culture, we like to get dressed up, we like to look cute, there's so much of a culture of adornment that is part of Black and brown ethnicity about looking good. And a lot of that too stems from poverty or the inability to obtain respect because of white supremacy. So the dressing up and the adornment is a way to sort of claim not just your identity and expression, but your ability to be able to be seen and respected.
And we should clarify that the Zoot Suit, from what we can tell, did kind of move from Black community into the Latino community. But Emily, go ahead.
Well, it just also makes me, I'm thinking about, as it relates to where we are today, in Warren Stories, we interviewed Congresswoman Frederica Wilson. She's known for wearing her very distinctive cowboy hats, and she talks about, her ensemble. And what she talks about is, they are brightly colored, they're very vibrant, and she's a Black woman in Congress, and she says, I wear them to get noticed. And she says, and I'm quoting from the show, it helps her get shit done. So they're having that sort of like kind of noticeable garment. It's a form of creative expression, but it also can really, help you in your work and help you make a statement in so many other ways.
And I think that connection between Black fashion and Latino fashion is important because it ties in the white imagination Latinos to African Americans. And so in the U.S., a lot of times racial identity of brown people is sort of calculated by nearness to Black people. And so I think that element is really important to highlight.
Right. And then you have thinking about Trayvon Martin and the hoodie and what the hoodie symbolizes. I mean, even the fact there's an artist, David Hammonds, who made an artwork. I think I cannot remember what it was called, but basically it was, a disembodied hoodie that he tacked up to a wall. And so this is something that, that also is just an indicator as well, I think.
Well, I mean, I think it's that in some way, clothing is going to be a proxy for racial othering in both directions, right? Either you're dressing down and you're dressing like a thug, or, you're dressing up too much, right? And you're stepping out of line, right? I mean, it's just either way, it's going to kind of get politicized in that way. Let me tell you a story, a true story, about my first summer barbecue of the season. Memorial Day, 80 degrees, lovely weather, friends over at my house, I'm manning the grill. I get lots of compliments on the burgers I cooked, but the thing that 4 different people complimented me on, independent of one another, the blue polo shirt I was wearing. It is, in fact, an organic cotton silk polo, which I got for $50 on Quince. If you are gearing up for the summer, you are likely feeling that familiar urge to refresh your closet, but also not waste money on pieces that you'll only wear once or just for one season. Well, when you shop at Quince, you'll find clothes that are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It's luxury without the markup. And if my experience is any indication, you'll be getting nonstop compliments. How about that? Give your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday. When you check in on the news each day, doesn't it kind of feel like every story is a head-spinning economic story? Tariffs, meme coins, budget fights, not to mention groceries and gas prices. Economics is everywhere, fueling our lives even where you least expect it. You're a This Day listener, which means I know you love context and hidden history. Well, Planet Money is the show for you. Planet Money recently did an episode that I absolutely loved, all about the more uncommon economic indicators being discussed on social media. Not just the obvious like prices, but sales of lipstick are going up, babysitter buns are coming back into style. A show like Planet Money is built to dig into all the little ways that economics shapes our lives. Every episode of Planet Money is fun, illuminating, and pretty short, 20-ish minutes, and you'll walk away knowing a lot more about how the world really works. Listen now to Planet Money from NPR. think there's also this World War II context is important too. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that we're talking about a moment at which there's rising jingoism in the United States. We're entering the Pacific Theater. There is tons of anti-Asian sentiment. And if you look at 1943, there were not Zoot Suit riots in other cities, but there were riots against black and brown people in other cities, often by servicemen who I think since Pearl Harbor a couple years earlier had been kind of gassed up in terms of the sort of racial elements of our involvement in World War II.
This is really important because one of the elements of this story that you mentioned in the intro, Jody, is the way that the press helped to stoke some of this sentiment. There was a guide in one LA paper on how to de-zoot a zoot suiter, which is how to take their clothes off, which was part of the violence here. It was not only beating people wearing zoot suits, but also taking their suits off. And this is at the same time that Life magazine is printing guides on how to tell the difference between a Chinese person and a Japanese person. So in part because people were beating up Chinese people thinking that they were Japanese, and Life was basically saying, it's okay to beat up Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. They're the enemy. But just make sure that you don't hit somebody associated with our allies, a Chinese immigrant or a Chinese American.
It's just, to me, the violence of this moment is not just about causing harm, it's also about causing humiliation. Yeah. So by, stripping someone down, taking their pants, taking their clothes, having them sit in the middle of the street in their undergarments to gawk at them and to laugh at them, it's an expose. And in the same way that, we think of like lynchings or these massive mob attacks on people, these same things are like motivated by the collective gawk, by people being able to look at it and to sort of scorn or point to what they believe is like the cause of their, nuisance or social nuisance or deviance, however you want to sort of categorize it. That's how Latino men are seen in this moment.
So let's talk a little bit about how these riots play out. I mean, one thing we should know is, it's over the course of about a week or so. There's just roving skirmishes, as we're saying. The police are often either looking the other way, if not enabling the white mobs. After a few days, it's about 150 people have been injured. The police have arrested over 500 Latino civilians, and the charges are, rioting to vagrancy.
It's interesting, too, because, this was a coordinated effort. And when I say coordinated, taxi cabs came together and said, hey, you want to ride to the Mexican community? Let's go. And they got over 20 taxi cabs to have this convoy of 200 people armed with clubs and whatever they could use to harm, to hit, to cause violence against Mexican Americans and Mexicans in their community. So this was not just like a happenstance. This was people coming together to be destructive.
And certainly, as with a lot of stories, but I think we're all finding this story is just so layered. I mean, it could be like multi-parts, but it connects to everything else going on, including not long after the riots, the State Un-American Activities Committee is going on, and a state senator during that says that he wants to investigate whether the Zoot Suit riots were sponsored by Nazi agencies attempting to spread disunity between the United States and Latin American countries. And so, again, it's just one of these like Rorschach test moments where just like everyone gets to impose whatever swirling issues of the day are onto these skirmishes.
Well, and it's also a way of just sort of washing any responsibility from these soldiers who were responsible for so much of the violence. I mean, ultimately, the soldiers are going to be barred from Los Angeles in a way to keep them from committing these kinds of acts of violence. But to say that it's the fault of the Nazis instead of American racism is one way to wash your hands of it.
Yeah. So as we start to wrap up, Emily, I'm curious if you can kind of reflect a little on this conversation we've been having about, dressing up as a form of resistance, or at least as a form of agency. Your book and your series talk to individuals in many ways about what clothing means to them. But do you see that as a through line in some of the work and conversations you've been having?
I think what I see, I don't necessarily see a pattern. I see a pattern of actually, things actually getting imbued with meaning that are very unexpected. So it's not as intentional. It's not something like, I'm going to wear this garment and then, I don't know, become affiliated with this group of people. It actually winds up being something where it's more like, this t-shirt, this pair of jeans, this thing, I was wearing it when this crazy thing happened. I think I don't see it as much of a connection, but I mean, I do think that we do make these very deliberate choices. Like there's a story in the book about a poet and what he wears to meet Obama in the White House. And he, wears this like very dramatic suit, this Tom Brown suit. And again, it is to get noticed and so that he can have a conversation and engage with Obama. And I think that there are these moments where it's just like associating, highlight a moment in your life with the thing that you're wearing. And that does happen with when we get dressed up. I mean, that's the most obvious, like what you wore to your wedding, what you wore to your prom, what you wore, we make those associations.
But at some level, this was fashion, and it was just how people wanted to dress because they felt good wearing it. And then it sort of attracts all these other larger levels. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to throw out, something I was thinking about is like, because it is fashion. Whereas like you think about something like the MAGA hat, the red MAGA hat, which is like, I don't know, if a red hat will ever symbolize, if anyone will feel comfortable just kind of benignly wearing a red hat ever again. That wasn't like fashion with a capital F, but that was just like a functional indicator of, I am with this pack. I am with, this is who I identify with. And so there was no fashion there. That was, to me, that was just purely practical and wanting to identify with a group.
Mm-hmm. I think about it in the same way too, of like the Black Panthers. You think of like the leather jackets, the berets, there's so much about social movements that I do think, fashion tends to shape how we perceive the movement as either, I don't know, something that's threatening or dangerous or cool or sexy. Like there are all these ways that, fashion shapes our understanding of who we think someone is or what we think someone's about.
Yeah.
And I think about, I mean, it can be as politically overt, but it can also just be like, you think about like the early punk rock scene where it's like, ripped pants and safety pins and t-shirts and or grunge or goth. And it's sort of like you're kind of looking across the room at, maybe it's a room full of people and you're saying, oh, that's one of my people. Mm-hmm. That's one of my, and as an identity, it's an identifier. And so I think that probably, I'd love to learn a little bit more about like the beginning of the Zoot Suit, but that kind of identification and that like the positive side of it where it's like, oh, here are my people, here's my crew. Here's my, I feel at home with these folks. 'Cause, look at us all in our Zoot Suits.
And the power of that combination of expression and belonging is pretty amazing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that is very much the work that Emily does in her book and her series. So we will plug it again, Worn Stories. Now, final question. Anyone who has met me knows I'm obviously a deep watcher on the cutting edge of fashion. But I say this as I'm sitting here in my schlubby t-shirt. But I have noticed, Emily, that the pants are getting baggier. Things are getting a little looser. Will the Zoot Suit, the upside down triangle, ever come back? Are we ever going to get that baggy again?
Oh, yeah. I think it's come back in various, you think about like suits in the 80s and like women's suits and, double-breasted suits. And I think that, and shoulder pads and, it leaves, it comes back, it gets like wider and looser and then it gets skinnier again. So yes, fully. And I do think as we emerge from the pandemic that people are going to be wearing clothing that is more celebratory, and whatever that means to them. So that could be bright colors, that could be, extravagant fabrics. My vision is that, I want to get a custom tuxedo made. So maybe I will actually be inspired by this conversation and do something that has, big pants that are pegged at the bottom or something like that.
I love it. Yeah. I love it. You're going to see me in a ball gown walking down the sidewalk just 'cause.
I think we should all be doing that. I think that, yeah, like I want like the thing that I wear to like every single party. And it is just like, some bright over the top. Yeah. there's something celebratory that I think we're craving.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. And listeners, send us your photos of your post-pandemic outfits, please. And we'll pass them along to Emily Spivak. Emily, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.